Oh, I do. I do. Well, I didn't hear a bell, but the camera... Oh, there we go. All right. Now we can officially begin. It's good. That's right. Good to see each and every one of you. Welcome. This is our adult auditorium class. If you're visiting, thank you. We're glad you're here. We've been in a series of lessons over a topic for quite a number of weeks now, and my intention is to finish that series up this morning if we're able. It may be an ambitious goal depending upon how far we get and how much discussion there is, but we've been talking over the course of the last several weeks about the subject of grace. And we spent some time defining grace. We spent some time dealing with some examples of grace. And we started with the Old Testament and noted that grace is not some foreign concept to the Old Testament, but God has always exhibited this undeserved favor upon His people. And so we looked at some of those examples, both in the Old Testament and New Testament, somewhat generically. And then we spent the heart of our time dealing with the subject of grace as it pertains to our eternal salvation. And we dealt with that over a number of weeks. And then we've been looking, starting I guess last week or maybe the week before, the practical side or the application side of grace. Some of the obligations, for instance, that we have to, first off, grow in grace. And that's what we talked about most recently, and we ended last week. And so this will be a very quick couple of 3 minutes of review, and then we'll pick up with this idea of living with grace, exhibiting grace, and extending grace to others and to ourselves. And then that will wrap up our topic. So we talked about how Peter reminds us that we have the obligation and expectation that we'll grow in grace. And that simply just means that we'll advance or we'll progress or we'll mature or we'll increase in this grace. And so we explored, how does one increase, grow, or mature in God's favor? And so we offered some suggestions, because if we're going to grow in grace, we ought to kind of think about what that looks like or means. Well, we can grow in our understanding, right? This was a point that we made. Grace is something that's offered, extended, but it's also explained by way of revelation. In other words, this was not something that was unveiled completely until the age of the church, until the apostles were guided into this truth by the Holy Spirit, and then revealed it during what is said in Ephesians, this dispensation or epoch or time of grace. And so it's something you can understand. So I have a simple question. If it's something you can understand, can you understand it better? Can you increase in your understanding? How would somebody increase their understanding and how God is favorable to His people? Studying the Bible. And so that's a simple way of looking at it. Our faith and understanding can grow. And also an appreciation for grace. I think, and this is just me speaking personally by my own observation and experience, the longer I personally have been a Christian and observed myself and others, the more I personally have grown in my appreciation for grace. I appreciate how much more I need it. Almost like the harder you try and the more you know, the more you realize how short you fall. In other words, the more you know about the character and nature of God as you continue to study and as you continue to have experiences, you come to appreciate how short you fall of His nature and character. And so that's an increased appreciation for grace. Also, as we think about this notion of growing in grace, we can grow in our praise for grace. I think I don't know if the word natural is the best word, but I think it's natural to credit ourselves, to praise ourselves, right? I think we kind of grow up that way, don't we? I mean, as a child, you do something good and your parents pat you on the head or pat you on the back, good job. Your teacher gives you a star or a check mark or a sticker, and you kind of feel this validation and almost, hey, I'm a good boy, I did a good job. Well, I think we carry that over into our, faith system, our religion, if you will, our spiritual life. And if we're not careful, we praise ourselves and say, well, I've been a good little boy or a good little girl, and I got this checklist mentality, and I do this and I do this, and oh yeah, I'm so good, I don't do this and I don't do this. But to grow in grace in part means I grow in my praise for God's grace being offered to me. Not, hey, look how good I was to receive the grace and meet the conditions. And so in Ephesians 1, it's to the praise of His glory that He gave us grace. Not that we responded in faith, although that's obligatory, but the praise comes from what God offered. And then the reliance on it, to rest wholly and completely on that, not how good I can be. Listen, or how deserving I can be. And then that's the idea, because to grow in grace means I grow in my understanding and appreciation and reliance on the fact that I will always be undeserving. Oh yes, I do have obligation to live in a certain way, and we spent a whole period talking about that. You know, that grace teaches us that we have to live godly and soberly and righteousness present age, that there's an obligation to be holy and to amend our conduct to the will of God. But if you spend your Christian life just concentrating on amending your doings to the will of God and putting the emphasis on you're deserving because you have accomplished that, you're not growing in grace. And so this idea of growing in grace is growing in a reliance and an appreciation of it and a praise for it and a motivation from it. And that's what Paul basically said. He said, and I'm paraphrasing loosely, he said, the grace of God towards me was not in vain. And he went on to say, I labored more abundantly than them all. Speaking of the apostles. What was he saying? The grace that was extended to me was not extended in vain. I didn't receive that grace and then become merit-driven, law-keeping, works-based, and say, look at me. No, what he did was that grace, like the love of Christ, compelled or springboarded him on to the conduct and actions and life that he lived. And so maybe we went more than 3 minutes, but I think it was imperative that we kind of review some of that. Now, what does living with grace mean? Here's how I organized this. Maybe it's not the best, but it's how I did it. The idea that we receive and understand and appreciate and grow in this grace is not fruitful if all it is an exercise in meditation or philosophy. But when we actually live that out. And so I've offered a very truncated or simple or sample of how we might live or extend this grace. First for others. And then the next is going to be for self. And that'll be probably a more difficult endeavor for us to unpack. So maybe we won't finish today and we'll have to finish up tomorrow. I don't know. But the one for others is probably a little more simple. Now we already looked at this very, familiar example of the Pharisee and the tax collector. And Jesus tells us about this scenario or scene that two men went up to pray and that, well, the one was the Pharisee. And his mindset and attitude was, look at me. Here's my resume. Here's my spiritual pedigree. Here's all the things that I have done that warrant God to, be favorable to me. The deserving aspect. I deserve God's favor because X, Y, and Z. I've done this, 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 and this. Now, on the other hand, you'll recall the tax collector was, he had no resume to extend. He had no works to attribute that were worthy of him, soliciting God and saying, well, I've done X, Y, and Z, so I deserve your favor. Now, he was the one that went home justified, you recall, and that's the whole point. But part of this scene, that's very familiar, obviously, was that the Pharisee looked down upon the individual and suggested that he was better. I've done all these things, and I'm thankful I'm not like other men, and here's one that would be an example for me. And so he was not willing to extend grace to the other. Let's talk a little bit about that as we have, I believe, not only an opportunity, but an obligation to extend grace. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. Or we're told on numerous occasions this idea that we are to extend mercy and have that attitude towards others. For example, we can think really practically that we can do that in our speech. Can I get a couple of volunteers? First, someone to read for us Colossians 4 and 6, and then someone else to read Ephesians 4 and verse 29. How is it that I might extend grace to others? Well, here's one. Somebody read Colossians 4 and verse 6.
Let your speech be always with grace, seasoned with salt, that you may know how you ought to answer each one.
Okay, so let me first say this, and then we'll see if we can unpack it a little bit. What's the most difficult word in that verse, in your opinion? Anybody? Okay, maybe, but
Always.
I think the always is the most difficult word. Well, and then we can unpack, what does it look like or mean to let your speech be with grace towards others? What does that mean? Practically, what does that mean? This is the discussion portion. Okay. Okay.
Which lately is like, oh my gosh, everyone's sensitive, hypersensitive.
Okay. Let's kind of go back and back up. I'm sorry? Okay. Gentle. We'll talk in just a moment about kindness, right? And this idea that we have some... I guess the golden rule is something that we could mention quite often. The idea is that, the way you want people to speak to you, you speak to them. Kurt, you had a thought, question, comment?
Say grace as defined as unmerited favor.
Yeah. Yeah, okay, let me say it like this. If we look at the definition of grace, a broad definition, a simple definition, it's it's getting something you don't deserve, like a gift. When you are dealing with people, are we under obligation to not treat them in the way that we necessarily feel they deserve or have earned? It could be that someone has deserved and earned a quick retort, or they have been unkind, or we find ourselves in a setting or situation, whether it's in our family, our extended family, or it's out in the community, and someone is rude or unkind, or what is our obligation as we extend our speech to them? But I mean, in the context, we can see that there's some sharing of our faith, right? And that goes back to other verses that remind us that, well, we have to always be ready to give a defense for the hope that's in us. And that goes back to the point of gentleness, with gentleness and tact and meekness, right? But, okay. Has anyone ever spoken to you in a way that, in your assertion, was not very gracious? Kind of judgmental or unkind? I think we all have experienced that. All right, let's look at another verse, Ephesians 4:29. Who's got that? All right, go ahead.
Let no corrupting talk come out of your mouths, but only such as is good for building up, as fits the occasion, that it may give grace to those who hear.
Okay, I'm going to ask the same question I asked just a minute ago. What do you think the most difficult word in that verse is? No. Corrupt. Literally, it's a word that means rotten. Rotten. Ugly. Corrupt. It's something that is decaying or rotting. How do I say this? I'll just say it the way I want to say it. You ever been around someone and you talk to them and their breath is bad?
Yeah.
We've all experienced that, right? And so I would rather have someone with a kind word and a graceful word on their lips and their breath be rotten than someone to come around with you with good breath and rotten words that come out. And so the idea is that we have this opportunity to exhibit grace, to live it out, to extend it to other people. And we can do that with our speech. We can either draw people or repel people with what we say and how we say it. And you know, we've alluded to this, but in 2 Timothy chapter 2, if we start reading around verse 24, it says, the servant of the Lord must be, and then there's a list of things. Patient, humble. We see other occasions we'll look at. We have to be long-suffering. Kindness is part of the obligation we'll note in just a minute. Now, go over with me real quickly to what are probably familiar verses 2 and look at Proverbs chapter 15. Look at Proverbs chapter 15 and let's read the first few verses. It says, a soft answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger. The tongue of the wise uses knowledge rightly, but the mouth of fools pours forth foolishness. It says, the eyes of the Lord are in every place, keeping watch on the evil and the good. A wholesome tongue is a tree of life, but perverseness in it breaks the spirit of who? Breaks the spirit of who? Well, the one that hears it, right? And so we have some obligation to give careful consideration not only to what we say, but how we say it. And now listen, that's not just you talking to your coworker about the gospel. That might be you talking to your husband. That might be you talking to your wife or your children or children to their parents. That we have some obligation. I mean, life and death really are in the power of the tongue. And we can breathe life into something or we can breathe death into something. And what is our motivation for what we say and how we say it to the people in our life? The relationships that are intimate or that are a bit marginalized, maybe just a coworker, or even the lady that is waiting on you at the grocery store, or any number of scenarios that you can mention. All right, but keep reading. Look at verse 5. A fool despises his father's instruction, but he who receives correction is prudent. All right, so here is this reminder that we can offer grace and impart grace by the way we speak to people. All right, well, I'll have a little more to say about that, and hopefully it'll kind of come together because this is, I guess, overlapping. How is it that we can live out grace and extend it to others? And we looked at that example of the Pharisee. Was he extending grace to the individual who incidentally was soliciting God for that very thing? Not what he deserved, not what he'd earned, but he's asking God to be merciful. But here's this man who claims to be, I don't know, in harmony with God, who doesn't seem to extend him any mercy. That makes sense? And so, let's talk a little bit about grace in terms of kindness. Look first over with me at Ephesians 2. We've looked at this quite a bit. In fact, I guess we could argue we started here. For we are saved by grace through faith in Ephesians 2 and verse 8. And then we mentioned that there's this unflattering description of the lost individual in the first 3 verses of the chapter, and then this transition in verse 4, but God. It doesn't say man is really, rebellious and defiant and self-indulgent, and man really, picked himself up by his bootstraps and fixed his doings. No, it says God intervened. Right. Look at verse 4. But God, who is rich in mercy, because of his great love with which he loved us, even when we were dead in trespasses, made us alive together with Christ. By grace you have been saved. All right, but let's drop down and look at verse 7. That in the ages to come he might show the exceeding riches of his grace in his kindness toward us. Okay, so how does God demonstrate that he is gracious? By him being kind to us when we don't deserve it, when we have done nothing to earn it. Do you see the application? How do we extend grace to other people? Oh, I don't mean that we offer them their soul's salvation because we offered them. No. I'm talking about how he showed his grace towards us in being kind to us when we didn't deserve it and hadn't earned it. How might we extend grace to other people? I reckon we could be kind to them even when they haven't earned it and don't deserve it. I mean, was Jesus kind to people that didn't deserve it? Did he go out of his way to be gracious and merciful to people that certainly didn't earn it or deserve it? Yeah. Let's look at one more verse. Again, describing grace as an act of not only mercy, but an act of kindness. Look at the book of Titus, chapter 3, and start reading with me in verse 4. Again, it's a very similar, outline from Ephesians 2, a description kind of the nature of man. It says in verse 3, "For we ourselves were once," and this is not a list that's exhausted, "foolish, disobedient, deceived, serving various lusts and pleasures, living in malice, envy, hateful and hating one another." That's what we were. Again, the same transition of Ephesians 2:4, coincidentally, it's now in 3:4. "But when the kindness and love of God our Savior toward man appeared, not by works of righteousness which we have done," well, what was it? It was grace, mercy. "But according to His mercy He saved us." Well, note that. It's kindness and love of God toward who? Us. And who's the us? Well, if we go to Romans chapter 5, ungodly sinners. I mean, look, I'm not trying to be overtly mean, but the description of man without God's intervention is not flattering. And you know that by observation of yourself and others. If you don't, start watching some true crimes, and that's kind of like this end of the spectrum. These true crime shows where people are just going around killing one another. I mean, it's just ludicrous. But on some end of the spectrum, we're all guilty of being depraved and sinful and nowhere near the communion and harmony of a holy God that would warrant us to suggest we'd done anything to deserve it or earn that position. Did any of us ever suggest, well, I earned the position in my favor with God because I did X, Y, Z? No, of course not. And so here's this description of grace as kindness. Okay, let me see if I can. I'll say it like this. Do we live in a kind world? Okay, as I look around the room, there's no kids in here. We all have some experience, in life. Are people more kind or less kind than maybe when we were growing up? And that's just a broad generality. Is there anybody that would argue that people are more kind than they used to be? Okay, I don't think so either. And I'm not here to unpack all the particulars. Maybe it's the advent of social media that's a disconnect between individuals that allows them to be less kind. I'm not here to analyze why, but that's certainly a contributing factor. But in a world that by our own admission is getting less and less kind, would our kindness be noteworthy in this world? You ever done something kind and people just feel like taken aback by it? I mean, granted, a lot of times they're dismissive of it and, rationalize it away. But kindness is a dying virtue in our culture, just to a great extent, not completely. But by our kindness, we can extend grace to others. Now, to unpack all the particulars of that, I mean, we don't have time to exhaust that, but we can entertain it. And I can pause here. Questions, comments, thoughts? I don't know. Here's the question. Is avoidance a means of kindness? I don't know. Maybe. I mean, there might be particular occasions where if you were prone to be less than kind in their presence and you exclude yourself from their presence, it's a benevolent act, potentially. I don't know that it's I don't know that it's an ideal pattern. Yes, ma'am. Sure.
That's kind of the avoidance, is being kinder and saying something bad.
Yeah, I think that some people's lack of engagement is actually, if not genuinely kind, it's construed as kindness because they didn't say anything hurtful, mean, judgmental, unnecessarily hurtful or harsh. Other questions, comments, thoughts about this idea of being graceful to other people or extending grace? And for the, the Bible uses the term godly. And the idea is that we have some obligation to be, as the Bible describes, molded into the image of Christ. And so we are living epistles. We are known and read by others. And by the way that we treat people, we have the option and opportunity to exhibit godly traits, characteristics of love, kindness, mercy, grace. And we have some obligation to extend those things to other people, whether they're deserving of it or not. I don't get to say, well, they're not nice to me, so I don't have to be gracious or kind or be diligent to make sure my speech is gracious with them. Well, we're not dismissed from that, excused. All right, other questions, comments, thoughts? Yes, sir.
After knowing the love of God, we should live above the standard of what's happening in the world. We cannot help what's happening in the world, but we can use our life, let our light so shine that others may see the good work in us and glorify God in heaven. So we have an obligation, and our lives should be shining because we get to know the knowledge and the understanding of God.
Yeah, it's like the reminder that even the most villainous person loves those who love him in return. Even the most villainous person you can think of, well, they love their mama and they love, their family, and that's reciprocal. And if that's all you have not grown and advanced. That there's this obligation, not to just love those who love you in return, but even to love your enemy, an adversary, someone who hates you, someone who wishes you were dead or would go to lengths to kill you. And that's the idea of the enemy in this time. It wasn't just, you don't get along well with your mother-in-law, so your mother-in-law is your enemy. No. These are people who wanted to kill you, raid your stuff, and, take your wives. I mean, this was... You love them? Yeah. I extend grace and benevolence, love, care, kindness, compassion. I'm intentional about my speech and interactions.
So how do we justify war?
What?
How do we justify war as an act of violence?
Okay.
How do we justify it?
A variety of ways. Self-defense is a good one.
I'm sorry?
Self-defense is a good one.
I just want to know, we were still on. I hear people say things sometimes, and I think, you don't live in reality when it comes to, we have to protect our country.
Sure.
Protect ourselves.
Right. If somebody breaks into your house, we have even precedent in the Old Testament that you're innocent of shedding the blood of someone who breaks into your house to violate you and your family. And so self-preservation and self-defense are certainly means of justifying those engagements. Other questions, comments, thoughts?
Just add to that. I think I was sitting here thinking, it's not as easy
Oh,
as reading this, right? Because
Oh, no.
you're interacting with people at work and just day to day. For me, sometimes it's a journey. I definitely keep in mind that I need to make sure I season my words with grace. But when you have somebody yelling at you sometimes, it really takes a lot to make sure you answer them in the appropriate.
yeah, it's kind of like the topic that we had on the table just a moment ago, is saying nothing or avoidance of potential defense. Well, last time I checked, that's what Jesus did. He was led like a sheep to the shears, but he said not a word. Even Pilate marveled that he didn't defend himself or speak up or make some sort of defense, but he just didn't say anything. So it may be a tactic at times, certainly. That may be the kindest. Is saying nothing the kindest thing you can do sometimes? Quite potentially. Yes, sir.
I was just going to say, as far as the example, one of the examples that one I looked at is having a collision with somebody when it bumps into you from behind, and say to them, well, it's not as bad, don't worry about it. It's what the context is, what they normally expect.
Sue them. Yeah. Yeah, Ben mentions the example of someone rear-ending you and it being very minor and causing, I had this happen to me too, causing next to no damage, but the person is so concerned that you'll be litigious and, maybe even fake an injury in the process. Oh, my neck, But the idea that you would extend some grace and say, well, it's just a fender bender, not even a scratch. You okay? Have a nice day. That type of grace is, like we mentioned earlier, rare and noteworthy. All right, other comments? Yes, ma'am.
I think this whole concept starts early. Like, Craig and I spend a lot of time teaching our kids, okay, you're angry right now. Let's take some time apart, or maybe you need to go to your room and sit and think and then we'll talk. Because when you're angry, when you're upset, when things are happening, and I do this at work, like when I get a nasty email and I know I'm going to have to respond to it, I will say, this is not an emergency, I'm going to sleep on this, and then come back to it, because otherwise I may respond in a way that I really didn't intend to. And so we have to start teaching our kids that at a very young age, so that as they get older, they're, doing the same,
Let me ask a question, and I guess it'll be somewhat opinion-based, but I think we might all agree. With exception, your initial response, would you think that was typically you following your flesh or the Spirit? Yeah, I kind of agree too. So now again, we could argue there were exceptions, and I'm not here. But typically, if someone is in my face or someone is being ugly or rude or condescending or unkind, my initial response is probably my flesh. It's kind of like, if someone slaps you, then you ought to turn the other cheek. I know that's the Spirit telling me. That's what the Spirit says. That's the Spirit-led instructions from the Spirit-inspired Word of God, that I turn the other cheek. That's not my initial response. I'm a grown man, and if one of y'all come up and slap me, my initial response is not going to be, thank you, sir, may I have another? I mean, that's... and again, the point is not literally about somebody slapping you literally. It's the idea that this scenario plays itself out constantly. Like at work, someone sends you a nasty email, your boss yells at you, 47 other scenarios, somebody comes up and are ugly to you, unkind. Who knows what it is? But what you're describing is a discipline in exercising self-control and not saying the first thing that comes to your mind, or the response of your flesh to get ahead or get revenge or get over. And that's a lifelong pursuit and discipline and exercise, and we've all been guilty of falling short in that process when somebody is ugly or unkind or any number of scenarios. Especially when it's in your own family. Yeah. Well, the distinction with your own family is that, in my experience, is that you're not under the guise of exposure. Usually those scenarios happen in a much more familiar setting where most of your guard is let down. When you're in public and you're around your coworkers, your behavior is more controlled for the sake of not losing your job, I guess. But most people are not really themselves unless they're in their comfortable clothes in their home. Or they're not completely themselves. All right, let's explore this a little bit more, and then we have some redundancy here, so we'll probably revisit some of these discussion points. In 2 Corinthians chapter 8, generosity is under the discussion. Liberal sharing. Taking up a collection of your abundance to give to those people who are in lack as what's actually called grace. But the English word is rendered gift. And so the idea here is that you are being generous, and your generosity is referred to as grace. Your benevolent sharing is referred to as a gift. Now, how might we exercise generosity? Well, I think that's as obvious as it can be. It doesn't require that it be monetary, but we think about the examples they typically are. For instance, in James 2, there's the reminder of seeing a brother or sister who's in need, destitute, and naked, or doesn't have the appropriate clothing for the season, and needs help financially. And so there's an opportunity there to be what? Generous. Now, are you giving them a loan? No, that's a whole different ballgame. I've had people come to me before and say, man, I'm really in a tight spot. Can I borrow $100? I'm like, no, you can't borrow $100, but I'll give you 200. And then, when you pay it forward, return the benevolence or the kindness or keep this going. But it's a gift. Or we think of other occasions that are similar. In John, writing that we shouldn't shut our heart to the needs of our brother, but instead we ought to be gracious or generous or benevolent or share. Even think way back in the Old Testament, in the gleaning laws, where they didn't glean the corners of their field. Why? Because they are deserving, meritorious people in the community. No. Because you could probably think of 10 reasons they weren't deserving of that. You ever seen people do that? Like somebody will come with a benevolent need. Maybe you haven't been involved in this, but they'll come with a benevolent need, and then people will scrutinize everything they spend their money on. Well, it's maybe hitting too close to home, huh? But they'll come and they'll say, I need help paying my light bill, and I got behind on my water bill, etc. Yeah, but don't you drive a pretty nice car? And aren't those nails, don't those cost money to get them nails done? And don't you have a brand new iPhone? And so what we do is we say, you're not deserving of those things. You haven't merited it, right? And again, I know we need to use some discretion, and but the idea is, it's a gracious gift. It's a kindness that's extended. If they deserved it and they earned it, they would be probably able to pay that light bill, right? If they were doing everything that, maybe we would scrutinize their budgeting or scrutinize their discretionary spending and et cetera, et cetera. Well, we could do that. And maybe there's a time for that, and it depends upon the relationship and et cetera. But it's a gift of generosity. Or we think about even some of the ministries that we've talked about recently, whether it's the Magi boxes or the Walk for Water or other things of the sort. What are we doing? I'm extending grace. I don't think, well, hey, look, every one of those kids or all those people in that community that doesn't have fresh water, they're all deserving and have earned it. No, I'm just, by generosity, I'm offering and extending grace. And then lastly, and we'll get caught by the bell, but we'll introduce this and then pause for some questions or comments. Grace, forgiveness, forbearance. In Acts chapter 7, will somebody read for us verse 59 and 60? Here is an occasion of grace, forgiveness. I think we all know the setting of Acts 7. Stephen is being stoned for his testimony, faith, defense of the gospel. We know Saul is there and others, and they're going to stone him to his death. Will somebody read Acts 7, verse 59 and 60?
And they stoned Stephen, calling upon God and saying, Lord Jesus, receive my spirit. And he kneeled down and cried with a loud voice, Lord, lay not this sin to their charge. And when he had said this, he fell asleep.
I have a simple question. Even in Stephen's mind, were they deserving? Had they merited? Was there some type of means by which they had evidenced this extension of a request for their reprieval and their forgiveness and their not being charged with this sin? Had they done anything to deserve that? No. Here was a benevolent extension of kindness and forgiveness. Let's think about another verse that we'll mention. Let's look at chapter 18 of Matthew. We'll probably get caught by the bell, and we'll have to pick up here with this discussion. next week. But this discussion will be warranted because we'll also discuss forgiveness of self. I think one of the more difficult conversations we'll have next week is not the extending of grace and mercy to others, because I think we all agree that's obligatory. But then I think that we're hesitant to extend that grace to self. When we've fallen short, when we've made a mistake. To be kind to yourself. I think sometimes people are more kind to strangers than they are to their self. But we'll talk about that more next week. Let's go to Matthew 18. Look at Matthew chapter 18. All right, we've had the bell. We'll pick up here next week. I encourage you to read Matthew 18, go back to verse 21, and finish out the chapter. And we'll pick up here, Lord willing, next week. All right, appreciate your attention.